Hopefully I've got a bit of time to steal from Janelle, because she was so good. But I guess when I first started working at the ABC, we used to catalogue video content into dumb screen terminals, and believe it or not, this was actually the main finding tool for video up until August last year. And like most analogue catalogues, this system used a reference to a shelf or library number to locate a tape on a shelf. So it was reasonably suited to a broadcaster producing news programs in a linear fashion for a single free-to-air terrestrial broadcast television channel. Managing video content with this sort of approach kind of worked up until 2010, but then it became woefully inadequate very quickly as the ABC established a host of digital services to audiences across web, mobile and multiple broadcast channels. And all of this program relied on digitised, digital-born and yet-to-be digitised content, and working with network-based and more recently cloud-based production systems. And now we have automation and machine learning-based technologies begging to get in on the action. So around 2009, the ABC introduced a digital networked news editing system, and this has evolved incrementally since then, and this is Grass Valley Stratus, which we use today. You've heard from Janelle the approach to a whole of collection management, but I'm going to focus primarily on managing news video content. It's worth remembering that these approaches and requirements and technologies that are in place for television, radio, web and mobile and other genres such as drama, science, music and sports do differ in varying extents. But the underlying fundamentals of managing active collections remains the same across analogue and digital, text and media, business and public, and these are collection management, cataloguing and access. But what has changed significantly is the way we implement these principles, and there is of course significant change in the tools and resources, workflows and approaches, and the requirements and access points for this content and information. So back to news. This is a very basic architecture of the news environment. There's ingest, stuff coming into the system, which is then edited and produced, and then distributed to the screen of your choice. Our selection for our libraries occurs at every step of this workflow, and as I say, up until August last year, the best place to store our selections was in network-attached storage, which was just bolted onto this production system. Janelle's talked a little bit about development since last August, which is our digital archive. But the amount of digital content that's coming in and being produced and reversioned and retrieved and stored is enormous. We have content coming in from camera crews, they're ingesting it at local and remote sites, content coming in from agencies and providers such as Associated Press and Reuters, content coming in from third parties like government departments and other libraries and archives, and of course content we've retrieved from our own collections in-house, anywhere from the deepest archives, which Janelle looks after, to this morning's AM radio interview. And on top of all of this, there's music, journalist voiceovers, graphics, and the like. So as this content comes in, or it's retrieved, we keep it online in a live production environment for 7 days, after which they're automatically purged or deleted. Or we actually have to go in and manually select items for retention, but there is automated processes in train, which I'll talk about later. After it's selected, it's moved to attached storage and it can be searched through this production system, but it's still secured from deletion. So it's all pretty overwhelming, and we keep control of all of this using an old-fashioned collection development policy, which really for us is a suite of guidelines, policies and procedures that help us decide what to keep and for how long. So the most important thing is to identify for what purpose are you keeping items. And this sounds relatively simple, but we've had pretty robust discussions over the decades as to why we actually keep material. And in reality, there's many purposes. Their relative order of importance and the extent of overlap is constantly reviewed and defined, and feeding that discussion is continual change in technology, the demands of production, and conditions of external compliance. But once you've established the reason why you want to keep digital video, and once you've defined those reasons, guidelines and procedures can then follow to assist, and you can then design your tiers of storage, the way you would like to access that content, the level of information and metadata you want to put around it. In the case of television news, we generally have 3 reasons why we would like to keep anything, and any piece of content can fit one or more of those categories. And they are production and reuse, ABC Archive and Memory, and National Archives of Australia, or records compliance. I'll be covering production and reuse in a sec, but briefly, items for ABC Archive are those intended for permanent retention, and these would include the final story packages prepared for broadcast, copies of the actual broadcasts themselves. And there are other items that fit this purpose which may not be suitable for reuse. And they could be things like the chair or MD addressing staff, an end-of-year goof tape, or pilots that never made it to audiences. And finally, as a Commonwealth entity, the ABC is obliged under the Records Act to maintain records of its business. So that's not only your financial and HR records, but for the ABC it actually includes its broadcast programs. So for reuse, when looking at news content, we have 2 considerations in mind in selecting content. Items that have value for news and current affairs specifically, but also items that have value for the broader ABC. And they may or may not overlap with news value. We try to keep in mind value for footage sales, documentaries, arts and entertainment, as well as those other categories that cover national, historical and cultural related items. And you've got an indication of how we treat those from what we heard from Janelle. But our focus here is on items that have reuse value within the news and current affairs domain. And those type of items can be wide and varied, and these are just some of the examples of material that we try to keep. These are all things that represent an event or needed to, in order to represent some sort of subject matter, and it's driven by the content our editors and journalists need to produce the stories that they make. So things like crime scenes in court cases tend to have a medium-term life, defined by longevity of interest, investigation and trial. So apart from the more significant or notorious cases, most of these items are exhausted at the end of trial, and the material that we've already included in stories and programs tend to be sufficient for future reference or reuse. Things like street scenes and signage have a medium-term life. Logos change, fashions change, and our streets change, and these need to be refreshed regularly. We also try and keep content that can reflect subject matter in a generic or an anonymised way. So that's footage of faceless crowds in Pitt Street Mall. They can be used for a multitude of purposes, for stories ranging from cancer rates to consumer spending. But not all pictures are useful. So when we review this sort of content, we try and keep in mind an established set of selection criteria over and beyond the subject matter. So technical quality is quite important. There's no point retaining material of poor quality that's actually unusable, but lower quality material might be acceptable. If someone turns up with poor mobile phone camera footage of a Tasmanian tiger, we actually would keep that. But we wouldn't keep poor mobile phone footage of a Westpac sign or something like that. Some material may become out of date, and but then again, it may assume archival value that warrants its retention in the collection. And it can be used in a documentary or a drama. For any of you who saw Paper Giants, the story of Cleo, the footage of actual 1970s street scenes added significant impact and context to that drama. Short segments of footage might be okay for use in daily news programming, but longer durations are actually required for longer format current affairs programming or documentaries. And of course, copyright's extremely important. Material used in the ABC is not always ABC copyright. We get footage, as I say, from a wide variety of sources, and they come with a lot of complex terms and conditions, and so they have to be kept in mind when we're selecting footage. It may be that we just won't select something because it's just too complicated to reuse, but there is some valuable footage that we would keep if we were able to clear or license that footage again. And the others in that list should be pretty self-explanatory. But we also have some selection guidelines around specific subject matter. So these are just some examples of that. But for example, there's a host of important considerations around Indigenous material. Not only is it important to keep a good cross-section of images, but we need to consider a range of cultural restrictions ranging from the depiction of the deceased from certain communities to the depiction of sacred or other sites. So, for example, there are clear guidelines in place for the representation of Uluru around the appropriate time of day and the angle and the position of the camera that's appropriate to broadcast. So once all that review, clipping, conforming and securing happens, the cataloguing fun begins, and this is part and parcel of using information to make these assets locatable. But I do want to talk a little bit about naming conventions and terminology before moving on to metadata elements. In our digital production system, a key piece of metadata in day-to-day content making is the naming convention for digital files. This is a sample of naming convention we currently use. The naming convention provides something that's human readable, like a code that's easy to learn. Once it's learned, it allows users to scan a list of files, tell at a glance what sort of content a video file may be, where it might belong, what's required to process it, and it allows content makers to quickly identify which clips were recorded that day or commissioned or intended for a specific story. But to a certain extent, it also supports automation in that items may be automatically purged or retained according to the rules set within the system that monitor a pattern or format in that naming convention. But naming conventions themselves in the ABC have represented a bit of a struggle between, I guess, metadata formalists who believe well-structured and standardised metadata should do away with anything like ad hoc or representative codes. And on the other hand, there's the community, content-making communities of practice that actually require something that suits their production methods, the content-making process, and does not complicate their immediate business of content making. So we as content managers need to be pragmatic as well as strategic, working towards one while supporting the other. And it's important to note the use of naming conventions is actually standard practice in digital video newsrooms around the world. So in this example of library phone vision of a robust Young Liberals meeting, the content maker can see that it was retrieved from the library. Perhaps they were looking for it, they asked for it to be retrieved, and the system can delete it when it's finished because a copy remains secure in the library storage area. It tells us that it's mobile phone vision, explaining the poor quality, and there's a brief title and date in there that works as a readable identifier. The other point to review is terminology. One of the impacts digital video has had on production and distribution is changing terminology. So you must be already confused after Janelle's talk about what the hell's archiving and what is retention. Janelle and I know what it means, but that's what it means in the ABC. You've probably also noticed there's a million terms that we've actually used for the actual stuff that comes out of the camera. There are so many ways of describing things that once were referred to as film rushes, outs, stock footage, clips, master tapes, broadcast versions, news stories. And a lot of those words have no meaning in a digital environment. So establishing agreed terminology is difficult at the ABC, again, due to the rainbow of experience and production habits we have, as well as people latching onto the latest label for a new way of doing things. It's often highlighted in discussions between information technologists, broadcast technologists, content makers and information managers who spend a lot of time in meetings discussing what do you mean by a story. When you're talking about a program, you're talking about an episode or series. Is a podcast a program or not? So we spend a lot of time discussing terminology, and here's just an example of where we've settled in most cases. Raw media being the stuff that comes out of the camera, unedited interview footage, for example. Package. This is an item edited together to create an asset to be used either within a program or under a broad banner, like a news website. It could be a news story made up of raw media, library vision and other assets to create a discrete editorial item. So in this case, it's an interview about changes to taxation. But this package can be reused many times or re-edited on web, iView, mobile or television. Program generally is a schedulable asset that can be set within a specific time slot. And there's the more conceptual groupings such as series or seasons and brand, which recently has fallen out of favour, which would describe the overarching banner, like Four Corners. So a key reference for our metadata inquiries is the European Broadcasting Union's metadata standards, which help us label essences, assets, entities and processes. And these help us guide our decision making at the ABC, and they're easy enough to Google and search. A search for EBU core will help you point you in the right direction. But back to reality. The reality is industry metadata schemas set up by organisations such as the EBU and SEMPTI describe an ideal package, but there's no product that I've seen that fully complies with ideal schemas out of the box. And it was interesting to hear from Mac about the identifier that they use. For example, there are many organisations out there that purport to develop identifiers for content, but there's no real one dominating identifier. But they do, I guess, comply in some cases to a subset of agreed metadata standards or industry-specific metadata standards, but it's inevitable that you actually have to customise that to suit your own purposes. So, you've heard Janelle talk about our Content Digital Archive, CODA, which is really a bespoke cloud-based digital asset management system, but there might be some interest in some of the machine learning technologies that we've been looking at that we hope to apply to our next phase of CODA development commencing very soon. We formally trialled some of these about 18 months ago, and we recognised technologies progressed significantly even within those 18 months. We found that speech-to-text was reasonably accurate, with about 93% accuracy for the best performer or provider, with the variance primarily due to Australian accents. Since then, it appears to have improved significantly. And then there are other things we're going to have a second or third look at, because, again, we believe there's been lots of progress since the last time we looked. However, last time we looked, facial recognition was limited at around 30% accuracy with around 30% errors, with the rest unrecognised. But the use of content analysis in order to apply categories, which is the type of subject heading, holds a lot of promise. If you haven't had a chance to look at Google's natural language processing, it's worth looking up. The ABC's been going since the 20s and 30s, and we've got mountains of either uncatalogued material, of which these machine learning processes would help us index and make discoverable. But we also have a lot of manual card systems and indexes that we hope to scan and run through OCR and then run machine learning over the top. But interestingly, things like voice recognition, which is identifying who is actually speaking, has a very low success rate, even compared to the low success rate for facial recognition, and object detection and recognition, which includes things as the ability to recognise a table or the Sydney Opera House, and that was pretty low at around 25% success rate. But it's been heartening to see a bit of improvement in the ability to generate descriptive information through machine learning for content reference and reuse. Up until recently, it sort of seemed like most of the machine learning was about marketing and consumer products. I don't know if I've spoken pretty quickly, but I think I've reached the end. But there's a lot of things that are about digital video management that I would have liked to have covered, such as the use of metadata for time-based markers. It's quite a difficult challenge for us in content management. Managing project files, which are groups of assets, and text. That's a bit of a challenge for us as well. And it would be nice to go through a lot more about the storage and access architectures.
Maybe in the future. Maybe in the future, Sal.
But I hope I've given you a flavour of what it's like. Thank you.